Welcome to the Connected Teamwork podcast by Growth Leaders Network. How do we learn to truly thrive together? How do we stay connected to our authentic selves, each other, and our purpose as a team, especially when challenged? How do we unlock the deeper levels of group intelligence? Enjoy this episode of the Connected Teamwork podcast and learn practical tools to evolve the connectedness of your team to its next level.
Welcome back to the Connected Teamwork podcast. I'm your host, Hilko Farber. This is episode 52, and I'm here today with Luciano Miranda, who is a vice president at Medtronic in the Toronto area. Luciano, how are you today?
Fantastic. How are you?
I am well, and I'm really grateful to sit here with you. The first time that you and I met, I felt so inspired by your energy and integrative personality, which I'll talk about in a second. Before we talk about Luciano, which I think is also called Lucci, we'll check in with him in a second. I want to say a little bit more about the Connected Teamwork podcast so people have a sense of a little weekly reminder, like why are we even thinking about connected teamwork? Well, for me, it's like this. When humans get together and we are really in flow with each other, which usually means we're out of deep ego states. We're very much in flow with each other. We sense ourselves. We're showing up as ourselves, you could say, in our bones, and we interact with others from that place. It is very fulfilling. It creates trust. It creates innovation and effectiveness. All of these things that we as humans like. Conversely, when that's not the case, being in a team can be one of the most challenging and hard things one doesn't, because like there's personalities and genders and elephants and commitments that are not being honored or whatever it is. So the question in this podcast is, how do we develop connectedness also when things may not be going well? As opposed to me telling you all kinds of ideas that I have about it, I talk to people all around the world today in Toronto to figure out, so how do you do it? So Luciano comes to us with a beautiful background. He is a vice president at Medtronic. He says he's fortunate to lead initiatives that have transformed the way analytics is integrated into business strategy. He's one of the things he's proud of is the development of the insight ecosystem at Medtronic that enhances data management and analytics. And his approach has these pillars. It's human centric, fostering a team environment where support, happiness, and high performance are equally valued, along with a sustainable work life balance. He is focused on creating spaces where every team member feels valued and complacency is replaced by continuous innovation. He believes in the synergy of technical expertise and the power of human engagement. And he is one of these people that continuously is learning. His goal remains to develop organizations that are resilient, forward-thinking, and set the benchmarks in their industry. And besides that, I know a little bit of Luciano as being an avid sports fan, not only watching, but actually doing. And he said to me he's basically been involved in many sports besides gym and dance, which I think his daughter has been involved in. And so let's hear from Luciano about what he's learned about connectedness as a leader and developing teams. So tell us, Luciano, what have you learned about development of teams and leaders in connectedness?
I learned a lot, and not always with successes. Sometimes we talk about life, and things. It's almost like life is it's playing with us, where like everything that's really worth it is hard, right? You do a very hard workout, you feel fantastic after, but during it, it's not that much fun. And for us, connectedness, I guess I'll share a little bit of story about myself first to give people a little bit of background on me and how connectedness plays such a big part in who I am. But I am in Toronto, and like many Canadians, my family has an immigration story. So my family immigrated from Argentina when I was 13 years old. Did not speak a word of English at the time. So, when you think about disconnectedness, we got disconnected from our tribe, right? From everything we knew. Now, Canadians are amazing people and they're very welcoming, but you still have that inner persona, that identity where you come from a different place, and it takes time, right, to adjust. So as we went through the adjustment, trying to feel connected and part of this new tribe was always of utmost importance for me. I was very fortunate, as you said, right? I always played sports, so that helped a lot. Even though I happened to be okay in some sports, so kids were nice with me as I grew up. But that is kind of like the feeling, right, of being disconnected from your tribe, being disconnected from your team, and what happens now through life. And I think this is when I reflect back, I look at, I've done some coaching, which I recommend for everybody, by the way, is do coaching because it is next level. And when people say, oh, I don't need coaching, I'm like, listen, Michael Jordan needed coaching on basketball. We need coaching, okay? And for me, it was super helpful to work through some of these challenges that we all have. And connectedness is such an important part of who we are, as well as developing amazing results. Why? Is, when I look back at kind of what shaped like my persona, for example, a lot of it is through sports, right? Obviously, what immigrating has a huge impact, right? But also through sports. And I remember that the best teams that I played with or that I remember, or that we had the best euphoric moments, were not necessarily the best teams, right? As a matter of fact, one story is, we were playing in the Canadian Professional Soccer League, and our team was not great. And I recall this very quickly about also finding your team identity and coming together around that identity, that form of connectedness that was incredibly rewarding, right? So I think the two teams where I saw that was that particular team, where we realized that, we weren't going to be the most beautiful team to watch, and we had to play a particular style in order to win. We went from almost being last, once we made that decision, to we ended up losing the finals, unfortunately, but to making it all the way to the finals, right? And even though we lost, it was still a huge accomplishment. And the same was, with university, the identity, that form, and the bond, the connectedness of that team elevated us to a next level. Now let's bring that to corporate. In corporations, I think I've been chasing that ever since, that feeling. And I got the opportunity to lead teams and organizations like this. I feel very strongly about, that focusing, a lot of times we focus on the outcomes. But to get to an outcome, you got to focus on the inputs to get to that outcome. So, for me, building a connected team that is, rallies around its identity, that rallies around well-being, right? Basically, are most important, and something that I said I would ever do if I had an opportunity to lead a team, and it's really what we're doing. And I can tell you that it's working. I think when you have the immigrant story, Hilka, it's like you realize, obviously we work hard. Don't get me wrong, and I believe in working hard, and I believe in winning and achievement. But you gotta have, when is the party, right? You gotta have some fun along the way.
Right.
So for me, it's like, yes, you work hard, but we don't necessarily reward just working hard. Like if somebody comes to me, it's like, Luch, I work till like 3 a.m. to do this. Thank you. Right? But if that happens all the time, then it's like, whoa,
right.
I'm not gonna reward that, right? Like there's either I made a drastic mistake in how I set up the team where I'm forcing you to do this, or you're not focusing on the right things and you're not prioritizing, right? Because eventually you will burn out, right? And we have stories that I can share with you if you like, right? When we did burn out, particularly as we went through this rapid growth of analytics that you talked about, maybe we can dig deep into that a little bit about the burn.
I'm curious about how you prioritize well-being in a team. How do you do that? And what have you learned? Maybe in your own journey also. You mentioned this working with a coach in a moment. And because my sense is that's almost like that's wisdom that was hard earned. I'm just intuiting that. So I'm curious about if you can say a little bit about Luch's relationship with well-being, how it has evolved in his life, and how he now instills this in the team.
So going back, and forgive me, everybody, for the sports analogies, but I also like to CrossFit, and we have a saying, "Win the week, not the workout." Hmm. If you study the best performing people, like the athletes, they work extremely hard, but they have to rest. The body cannot run at 1,000 miles an hour every single time. In a physical event, that manifests itself through injury. It's easy. You overtrain, you get injured, you can't perform. In the business world, it manifests, in my opinion, through burnout. Mm. And then once you get there, performance goes down. Mm-hmm. Once you get there, disconnectedness happens. When you get there, conflict arises. And not conflict, I like to look at conflict in two ways, which is relationship conflict and task conflict. Mm-hmm. Task conflict, bring it on. We should all have different perspectives and let's have a good debate about it. Yeah. Once you move into relationship conflict, that's where the problems begin. Because now all of a sudden as human beings, at least in my experience, that's when all of a sudden we can have an open conversation, a conversation that's going to, show us some of the blind spots that we have through the back and forth, even though they might be a little bit uncomfortable. So, yeah, so I would say that is, to me, well-being in a corporate environment, any high-performing team, it's literally a no-brainer, right? Like in my world, right? So in my world, we do analytics. Great. We have to do some coding. We have to do some, dashboards. But there's a huge aspect of creativeness that needs to happen for that. Well, if we have people that are burning out, guess what happens to creativity? It goes away. Right. Now, if we burn them out, we could get short-term, and I've seen this, right? And I've seen this sometimes with people that may say, that maybe have a mindset more of command and control. Don't get me wrong, command and control is sometimes needed. I'm not saying it's not needed. But over the long run, I personally have not seen it, yield phenomenal results that are sustainable. So to me, it's about setting up a game that you're going to win, not only in the short term, but also for the long run, where people want to come to your team. So what happens? You end up having a high-performing team. People are doing well. People like coming to work in your environment. What happens? They talk. They tell other people about it. Right now, all of a sudden, you start attracting more people that want to come, and usually it's the high performers, right? That want to come more to your team. So to me, it's as much as a human aspect, but it's also a complete strategy on how to get the best results possible for the organization that you're working with. So it's almost like you get the result, but the result is as a byproduct of just creating a really good environment. Now, that does not mean that you allow passengers, right? Or you allow people that are just, saying, hey, work-life balance, so I'm not going to do my work, right? Or I'm not, because it's okay. They're easy going on us. It's exactly the opposite. We have to defend it, right? I tell you a story if you want. Early in my career, I made a very big mistakes, and he's now a very good friend of mine. Runs the supply chain of a major corporation. And this guy was amazing, still is amazing. And he was on my team. There was just a few of us on the team. And there was a particular individual, super nice, but was not really performing. And I did not have it in me to take action. And basically, he didn't belong in that team, right? So because of that, the superstar started, like, he was working double to make up for it, because he, in his mindset, it was just one that didn't, you don't fail. So so he was doing the work of two. And I remember when I went through that, and then I look back at it, I was like, I'm never, as much as it hurts, right? It's I'm a believer, you give everybody every opportunity possible. But if the opportunity is not taken, then you have to take action, because otherwise it doesn't work. And then we get potentially, when you say work balance, so on, people sometimes relate that with maybe, sorry for saying this, but laziness. And this is couldn't be further from the truth, right?
Right. So high accountability. We're going to take a break in a moment, Luciano, and that time goes so fast. I really resonate with your distinction between task conflict and relationship conflict, and also what you said about well-being does not equal doing nothing or being passengers or being lazy. And it requires taking accountability, and it requires holding accountable. After the break, I want to hear more from you about your personal journey in holding people accountable and holding yourself accountable, and how do you do so while still integrating this focus on well-being and happiness that seem to be part of how you lead. So we've been talking to Luciano Miranda from Medtronic. We're going to take a short break, and we see you soon.
You are listening to the Connected Teamwork podcast by Growth Leaders Network. Do you want to learn more about building the next level of connectedness in your team? Please contact Growth Leaders Network on LinkedIn. And now, back to the show.
Welcome back, Connected Teamwork podcast. We're talking to Luciano Miranda, VP at Medtronic. I'm your host, Hilke Faber. We're talking about well-being, and this last piece of the conversation, we start talking about holding accountable and the cost of not doing so. Can you tell us more, Lucia, about your own journey in learning to hold people accountable while still being respectful? Tell us more about that.
So I think it started with what we ended before the break on that experience, when I saw what my lack of inaction did to an actual person, right? Yeah. Because every time you have to take action, it's the toughest part of the job. It's by far the worst, right? You're affecting a human life and so on. So, but it's a necessary part. So for me, it was like, okay, I never want to do that again to a high performing person. So how am I going to do that? Because it's still not easy, even to this day, to take action on those things. So the way that I've learned to do it is, one, open and transparent communication. Sometimes I feel, all right, I'll speak for myself, but I would avoid the tough conversations. I had to give clear, feedback immediately on maybe something that wasn't going right. But I'm like, the voice inside my head would say, it will get better. Don't worry. Like, they get it, etc. And then that progresses and progresses and progresses. And then you're being unfair to the employee or the person in your team, because then they don't see it coming. So I've had things where I did that, and then you give them the feedback at the end of the year in the review, and you surprise them. And that's terrible, right? Nobody should be surprised.
Yeah. Right.
So the way that we learn, or particularly for me, is just open and clear communication and setting that up from day one. Yeah. And both ways, right? It can't just be one way just because maybe I happen to outrank someone. Is they also have to give feedback to me. None of us are perfect.
Right.
So if I don't get any feedback, that means they're lying.
Right.
So for me, is that open and transparent communication, Hilke, that's the most important part. And then what you find is people realize that perhaps you're not a fit in the team. They literally self-select out. Right. So very, very rarely you have to go to the end result, right? For that, it's usually a very small percentage. Because sometimes it's not like the person is bad, right? This is not about people being good or bad. Sometimes it's about people and their fit into your organization.
Yes.
So
yes.
So maybe it's not a good fit for them. It's not their skills. It's not. So let them know, give them a lot of it, and then they start looking in other areas, because they realize most people are really, really smart. They'll realize this is not a good fit for me. Let me go find something else, right?
Yep.
And then that's the best of both worlds, because they find something where they can thrive in, and find an organization that or another organization where they're doing extremely well. And and for you now have a new opportunity potentially to bring someone else that is a better fit, right?
Great. So I want to hear. Thank you for this. I'm sorry to interrupt you. I want to hear more about this little voice in your head, because I'm sure it's still there. I'm sure you're still in some part of you want to avoid these hard conversations.
Yes.
So how do you talk to yourself in a moment where, like, yeah, no, I shouldn't do this, the little voice says, but then you do it anyway. So how do you cross that bridge inside of yourself?
One is practice. I believe we all know ourselves really well. And I know when I'm convincing myself, maybe not right away, but with time, not a lot of time, you realize that you're telling yourself a story.
Right.
What story are you telling yourself?
Right.
What reality are am I creating that may or may not be real? Because then that reality gets broken with the, with reality, with the actions that are happening.
Right.
So I think part of it is it's just being aware and almost labeling it. I've been reading a lot about labeling emotions, right? When you're dealing with an emotion, label it to try to get yourself back into a positive state of mind, or at least giving yourself time. I read about, which I really like, is like, on my team, we have something called, we love the book, or I love the book, and I recommend it for everybody, which is Change Your Question, Change Your Life.
Yep.
So fantastic book, short book. And it talks about the judger and learner mindset. That has been a game changer, because a lot of times too, we have to make sure that we are not telling ourselves a story that is not accurate to the person, because that person is very different than what we are. Right. So it works both ways, right? So in my team, we often say, it's like, hey, I'm in the judger's pit. I need, literally, we have these conversations in our one-on-ones where like the team will come in, and I'll do the same, right? It's like, hey, I know I'm in the judger's pit, but just let it up. I'm like, go.
Right.
And that all comes out, and then you say, okay, now let's change the question. Let's go to the learner path, right?
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes as humans, we need time, right? There's a lot of, again, in my opinion, there's a lot of folks like, hey, always think positively, always think positive. And I, don't get me wrong, I like that. But it gets to a point where we're human beings, and we're made up of positives and negatives. And sometimes you have to allow, at least for me, that negativity to just come out, right? In a control way, of course.
Yes. Yeah.
Just so that it does come out in a controlled way and not in a negative way. So how do I know that one is I get this feeling in my gut that I'm telling myself a story, and through practice, I've been able to identify it when I'm telling myself a story that potentially needs it. Now, the other thing that I would say is immediate feedback, right? So don't let it, is something happen that is not the way that maybe we want to the team identity, or the behaviors that we want, or, or whatever it is, deal with it, right? Have the conversation, give everybody an opportunity, because they may have a blind spot. They may think they did nothing wrong. So you have to also, again, not be a judger and assume that they're doing it in a negative intent, or that they're not good, when everybody has a really positive outcome to contribute.
Yes. I love this idea of creating a safe space for the judger to speak by having that, what we can call a language marker in the team. Like, that's the judging pit. It's there. We're humans. We all have this plethora of voices inside of us. So it's not that they're not going to be there, and it would be inhuman to have only positive voices in you. That's not reality. Reality is you got all the stuff. And so I love that you have this mechanism in your team where you create space for it. And then you don't stay stuck there by asking these different learner questions. So, what would you say to somebody, Luciano, who is currently in a team situation where there's a lot of disconnect? You could say a lot of relationship conflict, right? Where it's gotten to that stage. What would you say to a team member like that about where to start or what to do?
So first, I think you have to take a step back, in my opinion, and say, do you have a team identity? What do you stand for? Because the relationship conflict may simply be because there is no identity. Are there goals that we're going after? They may be trying to solve the same thing, but in vastly different ways, which ultimately, if you're not careful, task conflict can turn into relationship conflict, right? Again, judger, this person doesn't like me. They think I'm stupid, right? What's wrong with them? So part of it is, number one, when we have those situations, because they do happen, again, change the question. If you have that, it takes two people minimum to have relationship conflict.
Right.
There's two options. You can keep with the conflict, right? Or you can start coaching them to try to get away from the conflict by changing the question. Right? So I've had folks that sometimes we mentor and they say, my boss does this and that, right? And what's wrong with them, and all that there is actually, if you Google judger versus learner, there's like a really cool map that has it's a one pager. I actually have it. I have it in a PDF somewhere, right? I think I know by heart now, but and we share this at every team all hands meeting that we have, to remind everybody of the judger versus learner. So the first thing I would say is change the question. If you have a relationship conflict, what do they need? What are they missing? Right? So versus what's wrong with them? Why don't they see my point of view? Right? What is it that they're after? Now, you may go through that learner path and still realize that, I always say, I tell my daughter all the time, there are 8 billion people in the world. Someone's not going to like you. It happens, right? And that's okay. But at least go through the path. And what we find is when you have this vision, as you go through the path, there's usually an aha moment. I can't tell you when it will be. I can't guarantee that it will be there.
Right.
In our experience, there is an aha moment that, again, it doesn't mean that you become best friends all of a sudden.
Right.
But it means that you take the relationship at work, the working relationship where you have to interact, one from a really negative conflict that brings everybody down to one where it's just productive. And that's it. That's okay.
Changing the questions. So first, actually, before even that, take a step back. And you could call that go on the balcony and take a look at what's happening with this team. Does it have a team identity? What are our goals? You talked about how goals and task conflicts can actually become relationship conflicts. And when you notice the conflict, and then changing the question. And some of the questions I heard you say is, as opposed to why are they doing this and judging them, well, it's like, oh, what do they need? What do they really want? And other questions could be like, how can I be of service to them? Oh, and what have I not heard about them? What am I maybe missing about what they're saying if I listen deeply? So, and this conversation jumps by, so we're almost at the end here. Closing reflection from you, Lucci, about team connectedness. Closing reflection.
Closing reflection is one, build an identity with a clear why. So for us, for example, is to empower every person that we serve and ourselves to thrive. We just happen to do that with analytics. But we win when our business stakeholders thrive, they make better business decisions, better results for the company, better results for our patients. So definitely a team identity. And, I guess I'll say three things. Your team identity, first and foremost. The second is a huge respect and adopting this judger versus learner. I was going to say, if you ever need to practice this, every day when you go out driving, it's a perfect way to practice judger versus learner. Somebody cuts you off and people honk and you say, but take a step back and practice that point. Would you still be angry at that person if you knew that maybe they were rushing to the hospital for an emergency? Right. So that would be a perfect way to practice it, because it's like, what's wrong with them? Why did they cut me off? Versus, what is it that they did that? What could be going on in their lives? Right. And then just, constant connection. Even today, for example, my team is remote. So for us, it's a little bit more difficult. Nothing is a replacement for face-to-face contact, right? And being together. I always say, try not to go every 6 months without having that face-to-face, if budgets allow, of course. But there are ways to do that through the organization that you drive, and it's not something I would say that comes overnight. You have to do that, and it's repetition. I think in marketing they say, those Instagram messages, they have to hit you at least 7 times, they say, before you will remember it.
Right.
I would say you have to do it 20 times, right? And just that constant. And then again, you'll attract the people that you want. Doesn't mean that they all think the same way. One thing I'm the most proud of my team, we did personality assessment. We're incredibly balanced in the 4th quadrant. So we think very differently, but learn to embrace that versus potentially fighting it because somebody doesn't tell you what you want to hear.
Brilliant. So much there, Luciano. I hear in your sharing a deep respect for the brilliance in everyone, and you working very diligently to bring that out in every one of the people around you that you're put in charge of. Being clear about your why, making sure you ask learning questions, and investing intentionally in connectedness. Does not let it happen. If you're listening to this, maybe take a moment to think about what you're going to take away from this conversation. You can just apply right after this conversation. It doesn't have to be very complicated. Maybe you change the question. Maybe you think a little bit about, how am I reacting to a person that cuts me off in traffic or cuts me off in a meeting? Maybe that can be a little different. Or what is my why? Or what would it be like if I prioritized well-being just a little bit more? Thank you so much, Luciano. It's a pleasure to have you on this show. If you're listening, everyone, it's been a pleasure to be with you again in this exploration. If you like this podcast, you can listen to us on podcasts wherever you find them, Apple, Spotify, etc., on LinkedIn as well, YouTube. And this is Connected Teamwork Podcast, where we help teams evolve their connectedness. I'm your host, Hilko Farber. See you next time. Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Connected Teamwork Podcast by Growth Leaders Network. Take a moment to reflect on what you learned today that can help build your team. Also, if you like, think about one of your team members and what you appreciate about them. Let them know. Enjoy connecting more deeply to what is great about them. And see you next time at the Connected Teamwork Podcast.